Hello, I'm Vladimir, and welcome to this first part of Blue Sun tutorial series. What are we going to do today? Today we are going to recreate this sun-like shape. Excuse my perfect circle, and we will deal with the material and this morphing effect that we are seeing here. So first things first, what are we looking at? Well, we have a sphere with a volumetric material that it consists from some big details and some small details that we can see are animated. And of course we have this morphing effect that we were talking about earlier. So this being geometry nodes tutorial, first and things first, we will create a geometry nodes tree. So I switch to my geometry nodes workspace. I have here on the bottom the geometry node editor. Here we have the spreadsheet editor that will be very useful later. And I think you know the rest of the windows. We have all that we need here. So let's add an object. Doesn't really matter what object. Let's put a cube here. Why not? And I'm going to move it to the object collection. And naming is very important, especially when your projects are growing in complexity. So I want to know what I'm looking at in the outliner. So this is a geometry node tree. This will be the controller of our effect, and also I know it's going to be animated. And what we'll deal with the sun-like shape and the text. Okay, so now we know what we have here. Let's press new. We have a new geometry node text. I copied the name and I'm gonna paste it here. Little tip here, in many places in Blender, if you just hover with the mouse over a field, you can copy and paste text. So we can paste the name. Okay, so I think I should turn on my screencast keys. Okay, so you can see what I'm pressing. First things first, because we need a sphere, we will add a sphere, mesh primitives, UV sphere, and we will put it here. Okay, given the fact that we want to make this effect in EV, not cycles, we have to deal with the first problem. What is the first problem? Let's create the material, and we delete the principal BSDF. I switch to the shading workspace to be easier to work. If we add a shader principal volume and we plug it here and we switch to render view, I'm gonna activate now my lights. Okay, first of all, we don't see the material. That's one problem for the geometry nodes for now. We can't see the materials. We can sort of go around this problem if we add the original geometry here, which in order to not be a bother for us, I'll go to edit mode, press M, and I'll merge all the vertices at center because we don't really need the geometry. So now it's there, but it's not bothering us. So now if we go to the shader view, render view, yeah, we see the first problem. Because we are in the EV render engine, Even though we have a shape and a principal volume shader, we get a cube shape. If we were to switch to cycles, then we will have the shape we want. But cycles is really slow, so we have to use Eevee. So how we go around this problem? Because for now in Eevee you get this. You don't get the shape. Well, fear not. I'm gonna remove this node. Another tip: if you press Ctrl X, you can delete a node without cutting the noodles. Okay. So the way we will go around this problem is by using something that is fairly new in Blender, meaning the volume nodes, volume shapes. So we'll add this empty volume that will serve only to be a placeholder for our geometry nodes. So let's see, this is the volume, would be the material. I know it's going to be animated, then it's dealing with the sun and text, and it will be what we will see in the render. Okay, now we have a volume, and in order to use it, we will add a modifier, mesh to volume, and we will select our geometry node 3, which we can disable in viewport and render. So now if we switch to the render view, look, we can see the shape. Let's rename this material. Let's say this is a material. It's going to be animated and is deal with the sun and text. Okay. So we got around our first problem. We can access now the shape. So what we will do with the materials? Well, first of all, let me switch this to an image editor, and if you hover your mouse to the corner of the windows until it gets to this rose shape, and when you click and drag, you can close this editor. Now, I'm not a big fan of tutorials by numbers. I think it's not much you can learn from them. So rather than to punch the numbers and do exactly the same things that I did in my demo, I prefer to show you how I got to those results, and at the end I will just show you some screenshots of my initial node setup. So first of all, let's do some settings for the volumetrics. Tile size. This controls how detailed is the volume, and I found that 4 pixels is a good value. If you push it to the minimum one, 2, the render time will increase considerably, but you will be hard pressed to see much notice. Samples also contribute to the quality. I found that 128 is a good value. Distribution, that controls how much resolution it's shown when you are closer to the camera. So if it's pushed all the way to 1, you'll have more resolution in the front, where is the camera, than in the back. For our setup, I will set it to 0. We want something more even. We will also need volumetric shadows. At the end, before render, I will push the samples higher, but for now, we'll just leave it at this value, 16. Another place where we have to look for settings to the volume is with this volume material selected. You have this voxel amount that controls the resolution. Again, if you push it higher, you'll get better resolution. For our effect, be better smaller value. You see the edges are not so smooth, and that's okay. But given the fact that we will do a morphing effect with the text, we will need a higher resolution for that, so we will leave it at 128. Other settings that we care about, this exterior bandwidth shows how much the volume extends beyond the geometry. If we activate the geometry, this is our geometry. If we put the exterior bandwidth, you see, we get this. This one will leave it up for now at this value, default value. Fill volume, this one fills the entire volume, or if it's disabled, gives you this ring effect, which you can control. We'll leave it at fill volume for this. Okay, that leaves the density. This is an important value that controls how thick the smoke or the volume is. If you put it at 0, you don't see anything. And this attribute, density, is the same that we have here. So if we put this one to 0, again, we have nothing. So for the moment, it's okay with the settings for the volumetrics. For this effect, we want to use also this value. For the emission, we want this to be an emissive material, but like before, if we push this value, the entire bounding box of the volume is filled. So again, we need to mask it, and for that we can use this attribute node. Basically, you put here an attribute. So hovering here, Control C, copy, Control V. So now we have this attribute that is the bounding of our volume. So if we connect it here, we mask out the pixel, because like we saw before, the zero number means zero density. Zero also. And increasing this to 1 or higher, get more density. So in the bounding box, the 0 means no density, and higher valence to 1 and above will have some consistency in the smoke. Because we want to control this intensity, we will use a math node, and knowing that this is nothing more than a number, that means we can do basic math operation with it. So we know that 0 multiplied by anything will amount to 0. So that means that if we multiply by any value, we will just control this area. And this is basically what we will do next. So for the moment, we'll put the density to 0. We will have only the emission, which can have any color we want. In the original, we had this sort of bluish color. You can use it now also. So how do we get to this that we had here before? How do we get these details? Yeah. For that we will have to use procedural textures. So what are procedural textures? Okay, let's do something simple here. Okay, we'll add simple plane, and we'll this plane, we'll put a material, let's say textures. And we can delete this one. We will add texture, nice texture. In order to view this texture, we will add an input emission and connect it here to the surface. That is our texture. So a good way to control this texture will be with this node or ramp. What does this one does? Well, it allows you to manipulate the values. We have the 0 values here and 1 values here, and by pushing these sliders, we basically tell him that whatever we have is here, whatever value we have here, let's say here we have like 0.3. So if we put this on 0.3, this ladder, this means that everything that is from 0.3 downwards to 0 will become 0. Watch what happens with the texture. And same here, we will push all the values. If we move it down, all the values that are above this number, 0.5 approximately, will become 1. So that allows us to control the texture, any texture that we use. And basically this is what we will do. Now going back to our material, how we will apply this. Well, we will add this texture again, noise texture, and we will duplicate this node. Well, start my screencast keys so you can see my keys. So Shift D, we duplicate this node, and again, if we multiply 0 by any number, we get 0. So that means that whenever this texture has a 0 value in it, this will be passed on here. And something else we need to do, we need to map this to some values. So let's add the mapping node. Node connected here, and we need another node, coordinate texture, and we'll connect the object to the vector. What exactly have we done here? Well, we have this texture that we saw before, and we need to tell it where to start the mapping, meaning every point on this texture has to correspond with something on our object. So we need to map it. And we do this with this node, texture coordinate, and if we use the object output, basically we start the mapping from the object origin, which in our case is here in the center. And from here, all the values will be mapped in 3D space in all directions, starting with 0 here in the center. And this node also gives us the possibility to move the texture on the coordinates, rotate it or scale it, which you will not do, but it's good to know that you can do that. Now at the moment we see nothing, because the values are too close to each other. So we will add again foreground to compress these values, and now we start to see something. Now with this node, texture node, we can control the scale. For example, this is what we need. Control first the big details, and we'll add some distortion, not too much, and some bump. You can basically play with these values until you get something that looks nice to you. I will leave it at this, something like this. If we want more contrast, we can push the white value, and we'll get something like this. Also, this tells how you tells to the node how to map the values. It either can do a linear mapping, something like this, where every values are mapped equally, or you can do something like this, which is something more like this. Just different way of mapping the values that we changed here. So basically that will be the big details. Now we want to take care of the small details, and for that we'll select these two nodes and do Ctrl Shift D to duplicate them without losing the link here, and we'll replace this one. And we want to make some small details, so we will increase the scale of this one. Let's say something like this, and you can play with the values until you find something that you like. So now we have some big details and some small details. How do we mix them? Well, we can search for mix, and we need RGB, because this is a color, this is a color. So let's plug this one here, and this one in the bottom, and this one we connect here. And now we can get this mixing, which can be controlled by this factor. When it's at 0, we use basically only this texture. When it's at 1, we use this texture. And we can control the mixing by these blending modes, which I'm not going to get too much in detail in these ones. If you use Photoshop, it's pretty much the same thing. Different way to calculate transparency when you mix two values, two layers, two colors. For this we will just leave it this, and we can create this slider to get something that looks nice. My final setup, it's a little bit more involved than that. As you will see in the screenshot, I used more masking and more textures, but I follow basically the same idea. Okay, let's do something to know what we have here. Select this node, and if you press Ctrl J, and add a frame. This is for organizational purposes. Let's call this one intensity. So we have the intensity, and then we have this one will be the texture, one. Okay. Now let's do something with the density. We will do something similar. We will take two of these nodes, Shift D to duplicate them. If you get this, your nodes going somewhere you can't see, you can press the home key to see the entire node tree, and then you can bring it back to normal. We want to remove them from this frame, so we can press Alt P to do this. And now we will connect this one to our density. And we will use the same vector mapping. And now, apart from emission, we can have also density to the object, which we'll need for the text effect, as you will see later. And in order to see this better, this is the color. Let's put it for the moment something like this purple. Now we see which area is affected by this effect. And we can follow the same principle. I'm not gonna spend too much time playing with this one to give some substance to this volume. And if we want, for example, to isolate this area, the outside area, it's an easy way to do this. I'm gonna show you this now. I'm gonna put this one together so you can see better. We'll do some basic vector map. So let's search for vector map, and we'll plug in here, and we will use this function length. What does length does? We will still need the mapping here. This will be just a vector. We have, like I said, coordinates starting from here and going to the edge of the object. And basically the length is doing this. For every point on this line, gives you a value, how far you are from this origin. And it does this in all the dimensions, so you basically get a sphere. So how we will going to use this? Well, we will use it as a factor. If you remember from earlier, when we played with this density value, by the way, if you want to cut one of these wires, noodles, press Ctrl and right click and drag. When you have 0, we have nothing. When you have a bigger value, we have something. So if we, for example, like into this node, mix the color black, that means 0, and we connect this to the density, and we put what we did before here. When we are at 0 value, we use the first socket, this one. When we are at 1, we use the second socket, this one. So if we, instead of just moving the slider like we did here, we plug something here, like this value that we used here, we basically control this at every pixel level, let's say like this, meaning we have a value here, another one here, another one here. For every element we have different values instead of having just one value for everything, which is very useful because, like you see now, this effect is restrained to this area. And in order to control this, we can use Shift D, and we will change this one to scale, which basically allows you to change the size of this vector that we're using here. And if we decrease this, see what's going on here? Control the radius of this mask that we created. Basically, this is an edge mask. I hope this makes sense to you. So basically, this node length gives us a sphere that is a percent of the bounding box of the object, and this one gives us the possibility to make it bigger or smaller. Now let's change this color to something more appropriate. Let's do the trick with hovering the mouse here, Control C, Control B, and now we have this little bit of density also. So let's call this density. Okay. So basically, for the volumetric material, for the sphere, this will be the steps. Now let's take care of the animation. How do we animate these values? Well, if we change for these noises to 4D, we get an extra value, this W, that controls basically how the texture is mapped, the evolution of the texture. So let's put this both to this evolution. This one will be control the small texture. How do we animate this value? Well, time to meet drivers. What are drivers? Drivers are a way to use Python in Blender, basically. You can send Python commands to Blender via drivers. And you can put drivers in a lot of these values. So for example, if we run this node, this is basically holding a number. But if we click in this one, we put the hashtag sign, that tells Blender that it's about to receive a driver, meaning something that has to be interpreted as a command. And we're only going to use one command, frame. So that tells Blender to fetch the frame number and put it here. And to test this, let's open a timeline. So again, we hover here on the corner of this window till we get this cursor changed, and we drag and we choose timeline. Okay. let's press home to frame the entire range. And now watch what happens with this value when you change the frame. See, 244, 244. Now, in drivers you can put a lot of Python commands and map functions, but we will do this outside, so it will be easier to see. Basically, now we can plug this value here, and when we change the frame, this value will be passed here. But the problem is that that will give us an effect that is too fast. So let's do some math. Let's add a math node. Plug in here. Now reduce this value. Changes this to multiply, and let's multiply it by a small value. Let's say 0.1. That means that we basically reduce this value, 6 in this case, multiplied by 0.1, basically get something that is 100 times slower. So let's do Ctrl-Shift-D to duplicate without losing the connection, and plug this one here. So now we can control separately how the big texture is moving and how the small texture is moving. And in order to know what we are doing here, let's frame those nodes. Let's say my texture. Good. Now I like to color my frames so I see at a glance what I'm doing. So if we go to the properties of this editor, in this frame, for example, I have some presets saved for color changing. This is nothing more than going to this one, checking this one, and put whatever color you want here, and then you can just save it as a new preset. This is what I did, and I try to follow the Blender color scheme, like this is driver, this is purple. Okay, now let's see how this looks. First of all, let's set up the output and go to this printer, and I set it to be saved as a video impact encoding H264 medium quality. I also use half of the resolution HD because I don't need the resolution right now. And as a saving path, you can put here, you can navigate to any folder you want and save it anywhere you want it. But you can also do this. If you put 2 slashes in front, that tells Blender to search for a relative path. That means wherever you save this file, it will start looking from there. So I have 2 slashes, that means a relative path, and then I have 2 dots, says go 1 level down, and go to this folder, output, and then this folder, test. If you finish with the backslash, that tells Blender this is a folder, otherwise it will think that this is a file name. So with that, let's test the animation. If you go to your timeline and you press this little clock here, you can set up a preview range that is different from, can be different from your frame range. So let's say like 42 seconds, because we have 24 frames per second. So 2 seconds should be enough. And in order to do this very fast, instead of using render animation from here, which will render with these settings, we will do a viewport animation to use these settings. So we will render faster. So I go to this editor, viewport render animation, which will also use the preview range. So this is how I test animations to see it real time. I don't need big resolution, but I want to see I'm getting close to what I want. Okay, so it's done. Now we can go to render and view animation, or you can use the shortcut Control F11. And if we look at our result here, the big texture looks nice. Some animating nice, but the small one it could be slower. So let's fix that one. Instead of 0.1, let's say 0.5. We will not render again. From this point on, it's just tweaking the values and doing another render and see if you get the result that is close to what you want. And that will be something that I'm not going to do here. It's no point. So basically, that will be how you would set up a picture like this. Okay, now that we have the basic material set up, let's add the text. And in order to make this easier on you, it's better to have the camera set up the way you want it before you add the text. You can do it afterwards, but it's a little bit more involved. So let's get the camera a little bit closer. Let's also cast keys. Okay. So by pressing G from grab, move, G then Z, and again Z, we can move it on the local axis of the camera. So we get this zoom. Good. Now let's add the text and align it to the view and do a basic positioning of the text. Make it a little bit big and change it. Okay. Okay, let's apply the scale. Something like this, and go to the text settings and extrude it a little bit, give it some depth. Now, in order to use this in animation loads, we have to turn it into a mesh. So we can go to Object, Convert, Mesh, or you can use the F3 key to open the search menu, type Convert. I try to use such as much as possible. Okay, now with this text, let's say this is a reference text, and that's it, reference text. We won't use it here, we will use it in animation nodes. How we can type OK and we can now plug it see nothing for two reasons. One, we don't have enough geometry, so we have to add from mesh subdivision, the simple one. We don't want to deform the text as subdivided. We can keep it at level 0. And you see it's not how we set it up here, because that shows the text aligned on its origin, which is this point here. Okay, align at world origin, that means this one. But if we put it relative, it will be like we set it up. So now we use for our volume the text. If we switch to this shading workspace, we see a few problems. Like, it's not much we can see from the text. Why is that? Well, first of hint, if we go to the volumetrics and we look at this value, that is one of the problems. But even if you put it like one smaller value, we still can't see much. And that is for two reasons. These textures are set up for the sphere, so they are too big, and the volume is not dense enough for what we need here. If we cut this on and we put the density to 1, we start to see something. Also, if we go to the lamp, because this is a volume, and we change it to something else, for example a sunlight, we start to see the text a lot better, because density depends on the light. So let's leave it at the sun and 100, and now it's better. It can even work if we plug this one here. But you see, this volume, because of the edge mask, is giving us this effect, which is not exactly what we want. So we can fix this. We start to mix the text together. So let's duplicate this one and plug the original setup in the upper socket and leave it for 0 for now for the bottom socket. And now we start to increase this a little bit, something like this. We can also do set up some texture with different values here. So let's do this. To add a little bit of detail, Control Shift T to keep the link. Put it here. Let's move it a little bit, and we'll plug this one here. Wait for it to be calculated. Then we just going to increase the scale of this, which will basically decrease the size of the texture. And now we get something a little bit nicer. And if we go here to the modifier, the volume that we added, and we decrease this exterior bandwidth, meaning how much the volume goes outside of the geometry, a smaller value, you get a better definition of the text. We can say that this is okay. But when we will do the morphing effect, we will need to control this value. So let's add a value node. And for the moment, let's leave it at 1, and we plug it here. So we will know that we have to do animation here. So let's say this morph effect, and change its color to this purplish color, which I will use my and we will come back to this one. The others look nice, but if we want, we can also change this value to make different setup for those values. But for the sake of simplicity, we'll leave it like this. You will see an example of that in the screenshot from my original example. Let's get to the good stuff now and do the morphing effect. And for that, let's disable the volume for now and work with the geometry nodes. And now we get to the nice part. Okay, so let's make some components. How are we going to mix those two, the sphere and the text? Well, now we'll work with attributes to do this, and let's first see what attributes are, meaning all the stuff from this menu. Well, attributes basically are just some numbers that you attach to every point of your geometry. So if you, for example, let's go here somewhere. Let's quickly add a UV sphere. Move it a little bit here. Go to edit mode. So we have these points on the geometry that is connected by lines, and these 4 points connected by these lines, the edges, they form this face. Okay, so an attribute is a way to put a number on each of these points in your geometry, or on this edge, or each edge, or on each face. That's all attributes are, numbers that you put on these elements of your geometry. The fun stuff is what you can do afterwards with those numbers. Let's delete this because we don't need it. And go back to our geometry node 3. Because let's look, for example, at this search, let's say attribute, a from attribute convert. What kind of numbers you can put? You can put a float, you can put an integer, you can put a vector, that means a set of 3 numbers, a color, basically a set of 4 numbers, because you have alpha boolean, which is 0 or 1, yes or no, and 2D vector, which is basically 2 numbers that we usually use for UV coordinates. So you get to put a number on each point on your geometry, and that allows you to perform operation at vertex level or edge or face and change stuff. And you also get some predefined attributes or properties like the position. This is a vector, 3 values. See, every point of your geometry, like in this case, we have 3,600 and so points for our text. And if we switch to UV sphere, we have now 482 points. See, each point has a position in 3D space. We have this attribute for each and every one of these points. This is one of the predefined attributes. So, using attributes, we can do our morphing effect. How? Well, if we find a way to mix the position of this node, this geometry, the sphere, with this one, so we take the position from this one and we mix it with this one, we do a smooth interpolation. Basically we get our effect. So let's see how we can do that. First of all, if we try to do something with the position, Now we can only see the points from one of the two geometries. So let's fix that first. Let's join those. Let's put this node. And we plug this geometry here and this one here. And now watch what happens here. Now we have more points than before, because we joined the geometries. Simple, yeah? So now whatever we do with the position after this node, because geometry nodes goes like this. Start from this point and you go this direction. You start to evaluate things like this, from left to right. So if we want to do something separately in the position, we have to do it before we join it. So let's do this. Let's store the position of this and this before we join them. And we will use that convert node that we saw before. So we want to take, if you click in this field, you see some predefined attributes. We take this position and let's create our own attribute. Let's say you can put whatever name you want. I'll put position text. Okay. So now you see we have here an attribute called position text, which will change from float to a vector because we want x, y, and z value. We want all the three values. Okay. So let's do the same with the sphere. Oops, I lost the node again. Press home, get my node, plug it here. And now I can do a shift C. Okay, home again to send. And then let's call this other one here position. Let's say sun. This is short. So now we have. We look here. In this point we have these values, and this point we have these values. When you go here, we have both of them: position of the sun and position of the text. So now we can mix between these two values. So let's do that. Let's use an attribute mix, and we want to mix the position of the sun, the position of the text, and the result will be we will overwrite the normal position, and immediately we see something happening here. Let's look at it. Now we have, like we already know from the shader nodes, we have this factor, and this factor, if we put it to 1, we get the second value, meaning our sun, our text. And if we put it to 0, we have our sun. So basically this is how we can do this morphing, and in order to make things a little bit more organic and more interesting, we want to move these points at separate rates, because now we move all the points at once. See, if you look at these values, we basically move it all together. See, the values are changing here. But instead of using a number to control the points, we can create a number on each point. A random number would be good. So let's put an attribute randomize. So let's put this here, and we create, let's say, this attribute. We'll give it whatever name we want. Let's call it factor, because we will control the factor here. So now we see a new attribute here, a factor. Each point has a different value. See, this one has 0.8. This one, for example, has 0.157. So basically, this is what we want, because if we change the factor to an attribute, then we can do Control-C, Control-V here. Now this node controls the morphing effect. And if we put both values, because we have a range of the factor from 0 to 1, if we put the maximum to 0, we get the first object. If we put both of them to 1, have the second object. So now if we control those two values, for example, if I put this one to 0, this one to 0.2, I get something like this. I increase this one, I start to get more of this, and if I increase this one, I'm getting to the second value. So how we control these two numbers? Well, let's do the get frame trick again. So let's get the value node. Let's put hashtag and write frame. And now we get the frame. Okay, so we can control the frame here. And now we want to change these values separately. So let's use this node called map range. What is this doing? Well, it takes a value and you give it a minimum and a maximum. And then you can change the values. For example, if you plug a number from 0 to 1, let's say 0, 1, and you change this is the input basically. This is your input, and this is your output. Now let's say that we want the minimum to be from 2 to 5. That means that this node will take the 0 value and we turn it into 2, and the 1 value we need to turn it into 5. No, nothing. 5 this one. And everything in between will get a value between 2 and 5. So if you go to 0.5, you will get the middle between 2 and 5. That means 3.5. So basically this is what this node does. We change one range to another range. So if we put this frame here, we can control the frame rate of the effect here. So let's say we want our effect to start at frame 1 and end at frame 48 to last like 2 seconds, because like we said, we have frame rate of 24. So now we put the output to be between 0 and 1, and we plug this one to minimum. And now we take this one, Control Shift D to duplicate without losing the link. We plug it to the max value, and instead of starting at ending at frame 48, let's say we want to end this at frame 40. And give it like this. This clamp value is very important. That means that if we are below this value, we will clamp it, we'll use this value. And otherwise, we'll get something like, for example, if you have this, let's say 10, it's not clamped, that means that you will get value below 0 here. We don't want this. So we want to stay in this range that we decided here. So when we have values below the minimum, we will get still 0, and if we have values below above maximum, we will get 1. Without that, if we go to, let's say, frame 89, meaning below this one, we'll keep growing. But if we clamp it, see, we stay to this value of 1. So now we basically can control the effect with these two values. And when we get to the frame 48, we have the full transformation. And if we change it back to our volumetrics, it actually looks really nice. See, if we do something like here, and we switch the shading mode, we get this. And from now on, it's just playing with these settings to get the effect you want. So this will be the basis of this effect. In my original demo, I did a dissolving effect. It's a little bit more involved, and I will make it in another tutorial, because this one is gone long enough. I also do an off-screen arranging of everything, and I will post a screenshot afterwards of the results. I will show you now my original materials. For this material, for example, what I originally did, I will show you now. I had this set up. As you can see, it's a little bit more involved. We have some animation here for the, you see, we have the outer edge, we have medium details, we have some high details. So when you have the small details, I call it sun core here, and I animated those. See, this is the multiply nodes to reduce the speed of the frame, and I have the map range here to animate the scale of the textures. Okay. And I have a little bit more involved setup for the mask. You recognize the length node here. That gives you that spherical mask. And I use these two nodes with different bending modes to control the size and the fall off. The invert node gives you the ability to invert, obviously, color. So I can use the same fall off for the density of the setup. This is similar to what you saw before. Basically, the same principle like I showed you, with a little more details. For example, here I did some animation of the radius of the sun, meaning this in here. We go to the reference. At some point, the sun is starting to change shape before dissolving. And this is what I've done here. This one, and also here is the setup for the geometry node tree. This is the sun squashing. Is drive also by the frame. I add some rotation to the sun. This is the animation, and I use the transform node for the rotation. And this is not so important that we will dissolve because I will make in the next tutorial a more advanced version, nicer one. And this is it for this part of the effect. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next one. I did some cleanup of the file. So one thing that I didn't tell you about is that you can expose values on the geometry node tree, and the way you can do this with any value is by plugging a noodle here in this empty socket here, and then by using N you can open this panel, and you'll find your values here. You can give them a name, you can give them a tooltip that will appear when you hover over the values. You can give them a default value, minimum, maximum. You can rearrange them and delete them, and I will press Control Space to maximize this workspace so you get a good look of the new tree. What I did, I exposed the resolution of the UV sphere and I did this simple math here, so you will get a simple resolution 1, 2, 3 here that then gets multiplied, so you will get more values, and the rings will be exactly half divided, and the rest it's just like you saw. One other thing that I did and I didn't show you, you can make new drivers by going on most of the values, and if you right click you can choose for any value copy as new driver this value, and I use that in the material here where we animated the density textures. I get the same trick with the get frame, and then for the starting frame and end frame, instead of doing something else, I just copied those values from the node tree and I pasted the drivers here. So for example, if I change the start of the animation to whatever, this value changes automatically. Simple, just copy as new driver, paste as new driver, as a driver. So you don't have to punch the same value in different areas. So this is the cleaned up node tree. And for the rest, the dissolve effect, I will do that in another tutorial that I hope you will also watch. Have a good day.